This bomber lost its nose. The crew still completed the mission. The sky over Germany, February 1944, was not empty space. It was a solid, hostile ocean, an ocean of freezing air, screaming wind, and lethal metal. For the young men of the United States Army Air Forces, flying this ocean in a B-17 Flying Fortress was a paradox of immense power and terrifying fragility. The Fortress was a masterpiece of industrial might, 10 men encased in aluminum and steel, bristling with 50 caliber machine guns. It was designed for daylight precision bombing, a doctrine of sheer audacity. The idea was to fly straight, in tight formation, in broad daylight, right into the heart of the enemy's defenses, and drop bombs with pinpoint accuracy. It was a theory forged on drawing boards in peaceful America, now being tested in the chaotic, violent reality over occupied Europe. The reality was a world of blackout, puffy explosions of anti-aircraft fire that filled the air with shrapnel, turning the sky into a lethal junkyard, and of fighters, swarms of agile, ruthless German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, piloted by desperate, skilled men defending their homeland. A B-17 cruise mission was simple on paper: fly to the target, bomb it, fly home. But each leg of that journey was a gauntlet, a trial by ice, fire, and fear. They were not just soldiers. They were factory workers, students, farmers, and mechanics from every corner of America. Suspended 4 miles above the earth in a machine that was both their weapon and their cage. They faced a simple, brutal arithmetic: complete 25 missions, and you could go home. The odds of surviving those 25 were, for a long, grim period of the war, statistically bleak. They knew it, and yet, morning after morning, they climbed back into their planes. This is the backdrop against which a single mission, a single crew, and a single battered aircraft would write a story that defied all expectation. A story not just of survival, but of a stubborn, almost incomprehensible determination to finish the job, no matter the cost. It begins not with a hero, but with a machine and the crew that made it more than just metal. The B-17G serial number 42-3-1967, rolling off the Douglas Aircraft Company's production line in Long Beach, California, was one of over 12,000 built. It was given a name by its crew, as was tradition, a touch of personality, a talisman against fate. They called her Snapshot. Perhaps it was a hopeful name, implying a quick, clean mission. Her crew for the mission of February 20, 1944, was led by a 22-year-old pilot from New Jersey, Lieutenant Robert Bob Morris. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Henry Hank Novak, was from Ohio. Together, they were the masters of this 10-man fraternity responsible for guiding the ship. In the plexiglass nose, a world of its own, sat the bombardier, Lieutenant William Bill Connolly, and the navigator, Lieutenant James Jim Reed Lout. Theirs was the most exposed position on the aircraft. A fishbowl of glass offering a breathtaking and terrifying panoramic view of the world ahead and below. Behind the cockpit, in the radio room, was Sergeant Tommy O'Brien. In the cramped, swaying waist of the plane stood the gunners, Sergeant Frank Delgado and Sergeant Sam Perkins, manning the waist guns, swiveling them against the biting cold, and attacking fighters. In the ball turret, slung beneath the belly of the fortress, was the most isolated man of all, Sergeant Georgie Klein, curled into a fetal position. His world a sphere of glass and machine guns, spinning independently of the plane. In the tail, the final sentinel, was Sergeant Art Crowley the tail gunner, watching the perilous sky behind them out, the most likely direction from which death would come. These 10 men, a cross-section of America out, were bound together not just by duty, but by the profound, unspoken trust that each would do his job out. That the engineer would keep the engines running, the gunners would keep the fighters at bay out, and the pilots would get them through. On the morning of February 20th, their target was the Nazi aircraft production complex at Leipzig. It was a big week mission out, part of a massive Allied effort to cripple the German Luftwaffe by bombing its factories. The briefing was grim out. Intelligence predicted fierce resistance. The flak would be thick, the fighters aggressive out. As they suited up in their electrically heated suits, layered with fur-lined leather, checked their oxygen masks, and drew their parachutes, the tension was a physical presence. There were the usual jokes, the forced bravado, the quiet rituals. Then the start up. The 4 Wright Cyclone engines coughed, sputtered, and roared to life. A symphonic vibration that shook the airframe and their bones. One by one, Snapshot and her sisters lumbered down the runway, heavy with bombs and fuel, struggling into the cold English sky. The formation took shape, a vast, impressive and vulnerable armada turning east, towards the sun and towards the storm. The climb to altitude was a slow, arduous process. The formation, a vast geometric cloud of aircraft, droned over the North Sea, then the Dutch coast. A sight meant to inspire terror in the enemy and awe in the Allies. Inside Snapshot, the world narrowed to the hum of engines, the hiss of oxygen, and the constant, nagging cold that seeped through every seam out. The initial part of the mission was tense, but quiet, the calm before the storm. Then, crossing into German airspace, the calm shattered. First came the flak. It started as distant, harmless, looking black puffs, well off to the side. Then, with horrifying swiftness, it closed in. The Germans had their range. The explosions erupted around them, not as fire, but as solid, concussive fists of black smoke and invisible metal shards. WWII. The plane bucked and shuddered like a ship in a hurricane. Shrapnel tinged and ripped against the aluminum skin. Every man was sealed in his own little world of noise and vibration, trusting the metal around him, trusting the formation, trusting luck. Lieutenant Morris and co. Pilot Novak gripped the controls out, their eyes scanning the instruments and the chaos outside, flying on instinct and training, trying to hold a steady course through the maelstrom. In the nose, bombardier Connolly and navigator Reed had the worst view of it all. The flak bursts seemed to bloom directly in front of them, the aircraft flying straight into a deadly garden. Then the fighters came, a radio call tense and clipped, bandits 10 o'clock high. The German Me-109s and Fu-190s were sleeked. Swift sharks diving into the bomber stream. The air filled with the crisscrossing tracers of 50 caliber bullets and cannon fire. The gunners swung into action, their voices crackling over the interphone. Out. Fighter at 3 o'clock coming in! I got him! I got him! Hes smoking. He's going down! The plane vibrated with the heavy staccato of its own guns. In the ball, Georgie Klein spun his turret, firing at blurring shapes that shot past underneath. In the tail, Art Crowley fought off attacks from the rear out, the most vulnerable angle. For minutes that felt like hours, Snapshot was the center of a ferocious, swirling battle 4 miles above the earth. And then the hit. It came from a frontal attack, a wolf that came head on, its cannons blazing, a 20 mm explosive shell meant for the cockpit, struck slightly lower, out. It tore through the thin plexiglass of the nose with the sound of a thunderclap and exploded inside the cramped compartment. The effect was catastrophic. In an instant, the entire nose of the B-17, from the tip back to just behind the bombardier's position, was simply gone. Vanished. Ripped away by the force of the blast. The navigator's table, the bomb sight, the charts, out. Everything in the forward section was shredded and sucked out into the screaming 200-mile-per-hour slipstream, out. A yawning hole, open to the sky, was all that remained. The temperature, already sub-zero, plummeted to an instantaneous, deadly 60 below. A hurricane of unimaginable force roared through the front of the aircraft. Navigator Jim Reed, sitting just behind the point of impact, was killed instantly. Bombardier Bill Connolly was severely wounded, battered by shrapnel and debris, but miraculously alive, though dazed and bleeding, out, clinging to whatever he could in the mangled wreckage of his station. The blast wave ripped through the cockpit. The pilots were slammed back in their seats, their instrument panel shattered, glass and metal flying out. The control cables to the rudder and elevators were severed. For a terrifying second, Snapshot was a mortally wounded beast, noseless and uncontrollable, beginning a violent, shuddering descent. The mission, it seemed, was over. The only objective now was survival, the desperate hope of getting 9 living men, or 8, out of a disintegrating aircraft over hostile territory. But in that moment of utter ruin, something else took hold. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was a reaction forged in training, in camaraderie, in a stubborn refusal to let their friend's death be for nothing. Lieutenant Morris, fighting the dead controls, shouted over the interphone, a voice strained but clear against the hellish roar of wind. "Report! Everyone report!" From the radio room, from the waist, from the tail, voices came back. They were alive, out. The gunners were alive. The engines, miraculously, were still running, and through the howling gale, from the shattered nose, a weak, static-filled voice. It was Connolly, the bombardier. He was alive. The plane was still flying. And they were still headed, more or less, towards Leipzig. Lieutenant Morris's mind, cutting through the shock and adrenaline, shifted from pilot to commander. The aircraft was critically wounded, but it was not dead. The 4 engines, though one was running rough and streaming oil, continued to pound out power. The wings were intact. The rear of the fuselage held. The immediate, overwhelming imperative was to regain control. With the primary control cables severed, the B-17 was flying on its trim tabs, small, out. Adjustable surfaces on the larger control surfaces. It was like trying to steer a runaway truck with a pair of tweezers. Morris, with Novak's help, began the painstaking, muscle-straining process of using these trim wheels to coax the massive damaged bomber back to level flight. Each adjustment was minute, each reaction agonizingly slow. The plane wallowed, yawed, but gradually the violent descent slowed. They were still losing altitude, but now it was a managed sink, not a death spiral. The next crisis was the wind, out. The hurricane roaring through the open nose was not just deafening and cold. It was destabilizing and threatened to rip the plane apart from the inside out. It also created a vacuum, out, sucking out any loose object and making movement forward impossible. Morris ordered the crew to improvise a bulkhead. The flight engineer and the radio operator, Tommy O'Brien, began dragging anything they could find: flak jackets, parachute packs, a damaged mattress from a bunk, forward to the cockpit area. They fought against the unbelievable force of the slipstream, like men trying to build a wall in a tornado. They managed to create a partial barrier, a ragged curtain of fabric and gear that broke the worst of the wind's fury inside the cockpit. It was a crude, desperate solution, but it worked just enough to allow the pilots to function without being frozen solid or blasted from their seats. Then came the cold. The temperature inside the forward section was now lethal. Exposed skin would freeze in seconds. The electrical heating in their suits was useless against this onslaught. Frostbite was immediate and severe. Morris and Novak's faces, exposed around their oxygen masks, began to blister and whiten. Behind them, the wounded Connolly was in dire peril, exposed directly to the elements. The interphone crackled. It was the voice of waist gunner Frank Delgado. "Pilot, we've got a rope back here. We can try to get a suit forward to Connolly." What followed was an act of incredible bravery and teamwork. Delgado and the other waist gunner, Sam Perkins, secured an extra electrically heated suit. In the tossing, freezing fuselage, with the plane groaning in protest, and the ground 20,000 feet below, they began to feed it forward, hand over hand, like sailors hauling a line in a storm. The radio operator helped guide it. It took forever, a battle fought inch by inch against the chaotic, violent airflow. Finally, they got it to the edge of the devastation. With superhuman effort, the wounded bombardier himself, or perhaps the navigator's body sadly used as an anchor, managed to secure part of it. It wasn't perfect, but it offered a shred of warmth, a thread of hope. Throughout this, the German fighters were not finished. A damaged, straggling bomber was easy prey. The gunners, Georgie in the ball, Art in the tail, Frank and Sam in the waist, fought them off. Their world was the relentless tracking of enemy aircraft, the juddering recoil of their guns, the smell of cordite mixing with the scent of cold metal and fear. They protected their crippled ship and their shipmates with a furious determination. Each fighter driven away was a small victory, and through it all, a quiet, unspoken question began to form in the swirling, frozen air of the cockpit. They had stabilized the plane. They had tended, as best they could, to their wounded. They had fought off the attackers. They were still airborne. And ahead, still distant but visible through the broken windscreen and the gaping hole, was the smoke and haze that marked the city of Leipzig. The target. The original mission. Morris looked at Novak. Novak looked back. Neither said a word. But in that look was an understanding that defied all logic, all standard procedure. To turn back now would be the sane choice. It would be the expected choice. But to go on, that was something else entirely. The decision wasn't made with words. It was made with a slight, agonizing adjustment of the trim wheel. The nose of the shattered aircraft, or where its nose used to be, inched ever so slightly to port, correcting their course. They were continuing to the target. The rationale was a complex tapestry woven from duty, defiance, and raw human spirit. To turn back now would mean Jim Reed had died for nothing. It would mean enduring this hell for no purpose. It would mean the German flak and fighters had won. But more than that, in the strange, brutal logic of aerial combat, completing the mission was their best chance of survival. Alone, crippled B-17 turning tail over Germany was a guaranteed target for every fighter for 100 miles. But a B-17 still in the bomber stream, still pushing forward towards its target, was part of the herd, however wounded. It still posed a threat, and the formation itself offered a thin veil of protection, their own gunners and those of other fortresses adding to the defensive fire. So, Snapshot flew on out. The journey to the initial point, the start of the bomb run, was a tortured bullet out. Morris and Novak flew not with their hands and feet, but with their entire beings, communicating through grunts and gestures out, constantly adjusting trim, juggling engine power to compensate for the ruined aerodynamics. The plane flew with a permanent, sickening crab angle, its nose pointed away from its actual direction of travel due to the damage. Navigating was nearly impossible. All their maps and tools were gone with the nose. They flew by dead reckoning. By following the other bombers in the group, by the grace of God and the dim hope that the lead aircraft in the formation knew where they were. The bomb run itself was the ultimate test. This was the moment of truth. For this, a B-17 needed to fly straight and level for long, agonizing minutes, a sitting duck for flak batteries below. It required precise control, and it required a bombardier. Bill Connolly, wounded, frozen, lying amidst the wreckage of his station, was in no condition to operate the sophisticated Norden bomb sight out. It was gone anyway, sucked out into the void. But the bombs were still in the bay. The alternative was the manual release. Someone would have to trigger the salvo at the right moment, by guess and by God. Over the interphone, Connolly's voice, weak but coherent, came through. He could see. He had a view of the ground no other bombardier had. A completely unobstructed, terrifying panorama through the missing nose. He couldn't use a sight, but he could identify the target area, the sprawling factory complex of Leipzig, Mako. He would talk Morris onto the target. What followed was one of the most remarkable acts of improvisation in aerial warfare. Bob Pilot. Bring her left. Easy. Easy. Hold it. Connolly's instructions were calm, a surreal contrast to the howling abyss around him. Morris, straining at the unresponsive controls, nudged the plane. Steady, steady, right a touch. I see the smoke stacks. I see the buildings. The flak intensified, the black bursts converging on the formation. Snapshot shuddered with each near miss. The other bombers around them began to open their bomb bay doors. The moment was now. It was all or nothing. Connolly, his body screaming in pain, his vision blurred by blood and frost, focused every ounce of his will on the landscape rushing up below. He wasn't dropping a bomb with a machine. He was aiming the entire aircraft with his voice. Steady, steady, no. At his command, the radio operator out. Tommy O'Brien, who had scrambled to connect to the manual release circuit, hit the switch. With a deep, metallic clunk that vibrated through the wounded airframe, the bomb bay doors rattled open. A second later, the entire load of high, explosive bombs, their entire reason for being here, tumbled away into the sky. Snapshot, suddenly thousands of pounds lighter, lurched upward. They had done it. Against impossible odds, out, through catastrophic damage and the loss of a crewman. They had reached the target and released their bombs on the German war machine. A wave of grim, exhausted triumph washed through the interphone. But it lasted only a second. The mission was only half done. They were now over the heart of enemy territory, in a plane that was little more than a flying wreck. And they had to get home. The turn away from the target, the rally point, was the most vulnerable moment. But, for Snapshot, it was also a moment of slight reprieve. The bomb run was over. The intense, focused flak began to fall behind them. The immediate objective had shifted from attack to escape. But the physics of their situation remained dire. The aircraft was barely controllable. They were losing fuel from damaged lines. One engine was failing, its oil pressure dropping into the red. Altitude was their lifeblood out, granting them distance from fighters and a glide slope for home, and they were steadily bleeding it away, unable to climb. Lieutenant Morris made a calculation. They could not hope to regain the main formation out, which was climbing and heading west at speed. They were a straggler now, and every German fighter pilot's favorite prey out. Their only hope was to descend, to hedge, hop, to use the cloud cover and the landscape itself for concealment. It was a desperate, dangerous tactic, bringing them well within range of light flak and small arms fire fallout, but it was their only chance to become a harder target for the faster fighters above. "We're going down," Morris announced over the interphone, his voice etched with fatigue. "We're going to try to get low and run for it. Gunners, stay sharp. Everyone else, hang on." Nosing the shuddering aircraft into a gradual descent, they left the thin, loud, deadly air of the stratosphere and plunged into the thicker, turbulent atmosphere below. The ride became rougher, the groans of the airframe more pronounced. But as they dropped into the haze and scattered clouds over the German countryside out, a fragile sense of cover descended with them. They flew at treetop level, the fields and villages of a hostile nation flashing by with terrifying clarity. They could see people looking up out, see vehicles on the roads. Every church steeple was a potential machine, gun nest, but no fighters found them in the murk. For now, the journey west was a grueling test of endurance. The cold remained a savage enemy. Frostbite gnawed at fingers, toes, and faces. The wounded Connolly's condition was a constant worry. The crew took turns talking to him over the interphone, keeping him conscious, fighting the hypothermia that wanted to claim him. They shared sips of water from damaged canteens, words of encouragement, anything to sustain the spark of life. The flight engineers monitored the failing engine out, nursing it along with mixture adjustments and prayers. They crossed the Rhine, a serpentine landmark that meant they were out of the deepest heart of Germany. Then into Belgium, where the threat from the ground lessened slightly, where they might find a sliver of sympathy if they went down out. But they were not safe. Fuel was now the critical issue. The gauges were unreliable, but the math was simple and grim out. The drag from the missing nose was enormous, gulping fuel at a prodigious rate out. The calculations Morris and Novak did in their heads, factoring in wind, distance, and their crippled airspeed out, yielded a terrifying margin. It was going to be close, agonizingly close. The English Channel, that infamous ditch of cold, gray water, loomed as both an obstacle and a goal. If they could just reach the coast, just cross those 20 miles of water, they could crash, land on friendly soil, or at least be picked up by air, sea rescue. As the Belgian coast appeared ahead, a thin, dark line against the gloom, the fuel warning lights on the No. 3 engine began to flicker. Then it sputtered, coughed, and died. The propeller windmilled uselessly. Now they were down to 3, with the drag of a dead engine adding to their burden. The channel crossing, which should have taken minutes, stretched into an eternity. The aircraft, sluggish and heavy, seemed to hang in the air, barely making headway against the coastal wind. They were so low that the whitecaps on the waves looked perilously close. Every eye was glued to the English shoreline, a faint smudge on the horizon that refused to grow larger. Silence, heavy and tense, filled the interphone. Then, out. A second engine, number 4, coughed. It was out of fuel. The plane yawed violently. Morris and Novak fought it out. Using all their remaining strength, they were now a massive, misshapen glider with 2 engines, descending inexorably towards the sea. The coast was closer, but not close enough. They weren't going to make it to their base. They might not make it to land. Morris came on the interphone, his voice astonishingly calm. Prepare for ditching. Life vests on. Assume positions. The crew braced. The gunners leaving their stations, clustering near hatches. They had trained for this, but no training could simulate the reality of crashing a 30-ton aircraft into the freezing winter sea. But as the last drops of fuel burned in the remaining engines, a final, almost merciful, current of wind lifted them out. The white cliffs of Dover, a legendary symbol of home and safety, rose to meet them. They were over land, out. They had crossed the channel. The immediate threat of drowning was gone, replaced by the harsh certainty of a crash landing, out. Morris picked a field, a patchwork of green and brown near the coast. There was no time for ceremony, no flaps, no power, out. He flared the broken aircraft as best he could, holding it off the ground until the last possible second. Snapshot, out. The bomber that had lost its nose, but not its soul, settled onto the English earth with a tremendous, rending crash of metal and a cloud of dirt and debris. It slid, screeching, tearing itself apart, until finally it stopped. In the sudden, shocking silence, broken only by the hiss of steam and the crackle of small electrical fires, a voice called out in the wreckage. Then another. One by one, the survivors extracted themselves from the tangled aluminum tomb. Morris, Novak, O'Brien, Delgado, Perkins, Klein, Crowley. And, carried gently from the shattered remains of the nose, the grievously wounded, but alive bombardier, Bill Connolly. 9 men had left England that morning. 8 had returned. They stood on the torn wing, looking back at the unrecognizable heap of metal that had been their ship. They had not just survived, lout. They had flown a mortally wounded bomber hundreds of miles over enemy territory, bombed their target, and brought it home, out. It was a testament to the machine, to their training, and to something far deeper, an unbreakable bond, out. A shared will that refused to be severed, even when the nose of their plane had been. The mission was complete.